Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. For today's video, we're going to talk about transaction code SXMB_money. This is going to be a basic overview and troubleshooting tutorial. So for those of you who are dealing with XML messages to and from SAP, then this is the transaction code that we will focus on. Just so we're organized with the tutorial, I will give you an overview of the discussion. The first thing we're going to talk about would be transaction code is, and then we're going to move on to the high-level process flow, accessing and monitoring the transaction, downloading files from the transaction, which is really beneficial for support resources or even for those who need to analyze the issues that arise from the configuration, so on and so forth. Then we're going to talk about some troubleshooting information. Lastly, I will provide a summary of what we discussed throughout the video. What exactly is SXMB_money? This is basically a transaction code. You can quickly enter this in your SAP system environment. You'll also see that it's labeled monitor for processed XML messages. A while ago, I mentioned that if you're someone who deals with XML messages that go inbound SAP or outbound from SAP, this is a really helpful transaction code. And if we look at the screenshot below, you'll notice that there are several fields available for you to narrow down a certain XML message for a certain interface, if that makes any sense. I also highlighted over here that for those of you who have background with SAP iDocs or intermediate documents, anything that involves iDocs, it follows the same concept or logic where you can view those iDoc errors, the status, so on and so forth in transaction code WE02 or WE10 for iDocs. In our case, we are dealing with the SXMB_money transaction code. I also included some questions that can be answered by this transaction code, and these are just some examples. Were the messages passed to SAP? Were they processed? Was there an error encountered when we were trying to process the message in SAP? Was SAP able to send messages? What is the status of a certain message in SAP? Are the message flows active and running, meaning it's continuously feeding data and continuously sending data accordingly, so on and so forth. So these again are just sample questions that can be answered by the transaction code. For those of you who are not aware of what an XML is, I did include my personal take on it. So to keep it simple, you can think of XML as a formatted message that we send from one system to another. I also emphasize the word language. In other words, both systems involved should be able to understand the format because it is in their language. So you can think of XML as a certain format that helps systems understand the content. This, of course, is not a formal definition, but if you're interested in knowing more about what an XML is, the technicalities of this, you can refer to this post that I linked. Overall, the key takeaway is that you can think of it as a message that follows a certain format. It is how systems can communicate and understand one another. Moving on to the high-level process flow, this is a really simple diagram that involves third-party systems or non-SAP systems. So if we refer to the image that I created below, you'll notice that there are two systems involved. Let's say we have a non-SAP system over here, and we have our SAP system over here. So it's the green box. In between these two systems, you'll see that there's an SAP PO or PI. And both systems involved are basically able to communicate and send messages to one another. There are two types of flows. You'll see that we have an inbound SAP flow, meaning the non-SAP system tries to send data to SAP, and before it reaches SAP, it actually courses through SAP PO or PI first. The same the same approach happens when SAP tries to send a message to the third party system. It has to course through SAP PO or PI. This type of diagram is pretty simple and standard. There are cases wherein you can connect a third party system directly to SAP, but that is something that is not widely done because of security concerns or architectural concerns. We're not going to dwell on that for this video. Next up, we have accessing and monitoring the transaction code. So you can go to SXMB_money and select monitor for processed XML messages. So this is a sample screen. Simply click on this to proceed. And once you do that, you should see the screen below. You'll notice that there are three tabs. We have the standard selection criteria, advanced selection criteria, as well as user-defined selection criteria. I included some screenshots over here for those of you who are interested, but for this tutorial we will focus on the first tab, which is standard selection criteria. It's the first tab you see by default, and it is straightforward for you to use, and especially for those of you who do not have basis background or you're a functional consultant for another module, this type of approach would be best suited for you. Focusing on the standard selection criteria, there are multiple fields available for you to use, similar to how we try to narrow down IDOCs if you're able to create that association. The idea here is similar to most SAP screens. We try to filter out the search by entering useful parameters. So this is an example over here. You'll see that the date has an importance. I narrowed it down to December 15, 2020, around 9:16 a.m. And the end date would be the next date. So that's pretty much good enough for this example. And I also highlighted the interface namespace. This is an example over here. And if you're not aware of what namespace you're trying to narrow down, you can click on this button. This is going to help you browse through the available selections for you to narrow down the results. There is a dedicated namespace for the type of data or interface that you're trying to focus on. Once you're pretty sure with the details that you have, even if it's just the namespace and the date, we now want to narrow down what type of messages we want to see. So you'll see that there's a portion for sender and that there's a portion for receiver. It can be a bit confusing at first, which is why I included a bit of explanation over here. Ideally, when we say receiver, it would mean that SAP is receiving data. So if you want to narrow down the XML messages that SAP receives, then you enter the namespace details in the receiver portion. If it's the opposite, you want to narrow down the XML messages that SAP is sending, then you specify the namespace in the sender portion. This is just a summary. So we have sender, where SAP is sending the data, receiver, where SAP is receiving the data. If we also include the high-level process flow that I showed you a while ago, it would follow the table below. So you'll see that sender corresponds to outbound SAP, receiver corresponds to inbound SAP. I did include a note over here that this is how I have encountered the concept or behavior of this transaction code across different clients throughout my career. So if there is a case that a different approach was implemented in the SAP system you are concerned with, it would of course be best for you to personally analyze between the two. But the overall concept remains the same. You want to narrow down those XML messages. For the next set of discussions, I created a simple scenario just to make it a bit more organized and visual for you guys. So let us consider that there is a third party system called Finance Exp or Expenses, and it sends expense details to SAP and flows through SAP PO. Here I have a diagram so you'll see that the third party or non-SAP system is colored in gray and the SAP system is colored in green. So when we talk about inbound SAP, the third party system will send expense details to SAP. It will of course go through SAP PO and SAP PO will send the message to SAP. And for the outbound, let's say that SAP does some processing from the expense details that were sent. Let's say that it tries to post accounting documents, so on and so forth. And once that is done, SAP will trigger a message back to the third party system. So in this case, SAP will send the message to the third party system, Finance Exp, and it will first course through SAP PO before it reaches the actual non-SAP system. So at the end of the day, the third party system is aware of what happened to the expense details. Was the accounting document successfully posted, or if there are issues, so on and so forth. I also included an example interface namespace. Let's say that it follows this namespace. Now that we have our namespace, we need to distinguish between receiver and sender. For this case, let's start with receiver because we expect the third-party system to send details to SAP, and it is more or less the trigger point. Here, going back to the transaction code, I included a screenshot over here. You can follow the instructions or details over here based on the type of scenario or details that you want to narrow down. In our case, I included the example namespace in the receiver portion because I wanted to check on the inbound XML messages to SAP. In this case, I narrowed down the date. I entered the interface namespace. I click on the execute button, and from here you'll see the results. You'll see the list of XML messages that have gone into SAP. If you want to take a look at these XML messages, all you have to do is highlight the line item that you're concerned with. So in my example, I wanted to check the XML messages around 12:03 p.m. I highlighted this selection and double clicked on the namespace. Once you're done with that, you should be directed to this type of screen. And what I like to do is drill down to the payloads folder and click on the main document. So in the payloads folder, that is where you'll see the XML message that you're looking for. Simply double click on this one and you'll see the XML details over here. The first one will be window 1 and the second will be window 2. One thing to note is that the naming of the XML file is not always main document. It would of course depend on how it was set up to be. Now that I've seen the inbound XML message that I was looking for, I can move on to the sender portion. So the same logic applies. Simply enter the namespace, narrow down the date. Of course, this time will be in the sender portion. Then you want to execute. You'll see the list of results over here, and then you can select the line item that you're concerned with. Double click the namespace and you should see this type of screen. Drill down to the payloads folder and double click on the XML document that you want to view. Before we move on, I wanted to mention that you can also do a general search in the transaction code by specifying the dates only and then clicking execute. So all namespaces will show up as long as there's an inbound or outbound XML message. This time, let's move on to downloading files from SXMB_Money. This is really useful for those of you who need to analyze the actual XML file and it's not so readable in the SAP system, or you want to extract the XML as proof or for further analysis. What you want to do is, once you're done double clicking on the XML document under the payloads folder, this is a screenshot, you can click on XML message and then choose to download window 1, window 2, or save the entire message version. So what I like to do is just save it in my local PC. In this example, if I click on window 2, it should allow me to save in my desktop, and once it's downloaded to my machine or your laptop, you can view the actual XML document. You can view it with Internet Explorer, so you have a pretty clean view of the XML. And in some cases, I like to right click on the XML document and open it with Notepad++. So it's your preference, it really depends on your needs, but basically this is how you download the XML files and view it. Next would be troubleshooting queues. There might be instances wherein the XML message that you're concerned with would be in status error or scheduled. This is an example of an erroneous status. You'll see that there are some status details over here and you have the red circle or the red light. The checkered flags mean they are processed successfully, and if you see green flags over here, it means that it is scheduled. So if you need to check on each of those XML messages, you can simply highlight or select the line that you're concerned with, and instead of viewing the actual XML message, if you want to understand the error, you can simply make sure that the line is highlighted, click on Go To, and then select QRFC Monitor. This should bring you to the Q Monitor screen. Now, if you don't want to do this approach and you want to generally check the QRFC Monitor, both inbound and outbound, there are direct transaction codes to that. SMQ1 would be outbound queue. It looks something like this. You can click on execute. And for the inbound queue, it would be SMQ2. Same as the other one, simply click on the execute button, or you can of course narrow down the results. This is pretty straightforward for the troubleshooting queues because the details or the errors that were encountered when SAP was trying to process the XML message will be found in those views. That's basically it. Now we've reached the summary. First off, what is SXMB Money? This is a way for you to monitor XML messages in SAP. What is the high-level process flow? Usually it involves third-party or non-SAP systems. So we have the non-SAP system going to SAP PO, to SAP, and vice versa. When it comes to accessing and monitoring SXMB Money, you can go to the transaction code, select Monitor for processed XML messages, Enter those key details that you need to view the messages in concern and then click execute. If you want to download files from the transaction code, select the file in concern, click XML message, download window 1, 2, or the whole message version, and then you can save it to your local PC or laptop, desktop. For troubleshooting queues, you can view those error messages or see what happened through SMQ1 or SMQ2, or if you want to go through SXMB Moni, you can go to the QRFC monitor. I hope this helps you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.